In this tutorial, we'll explore several risk-reward ratios and how to interpret and compute each one. It is important to understand some key concepts about return distributions and risk measurements before we begin. Please review any topics necessary from the list of tutorials available. To compute any risk-reward ratio, our main input is a financial return series. In Portfolio Mason, ratios are displayed based on a 2-year time series. Commonly, any data length may be used, but sufficient history is preferred for more statistical accuracy. We'll cover 7 different ratios, including some traditional and other newer risk-reward metrics. We'll begin with one of the most traditional and commonly used ratios, the Sharpe ratio. The formula for computing the Sharpe ratio is the expected return minus the risk-free rate divided by volatility. This metric, as well as all metrics covered in this tutorial, may be computed for a portfolio or on individual securities. Some of the benefits of the Sharpe ratio include its relative simplicity and use in allocation algorithms, such as modern portfolio theory. Higher Sharpe ratios are preferable, with 0 being the point where a portfolio or security is not expected to be beneficial over a risk-free rate of return. One exception is for negative Sharpe ratios, which should be interpreted with caution, other than saying they do not add value for the relative risk. Related to this metric is the Sortino ratio. The formula and computation are similar, but in place of using volatility, we use downside deviation. The focus of the ratio is the balance of return potential against risk measured only on the downside or negative return side. Again, higher Sortino ratios are better, provided they are above 0. Our third ratio is called the Sterling ratio, sometimes known as the Kalmar ratio. This ratio maintains the same numerator, excess return, but the risk measurement in the denominator is based on maximum drawdown. Maximum drawdown is defined by the worst return loss incurred from a peak to a trough of an investment's equity curve. So far, this is the only ratio covered that uses a risk measurement that is path dependent, meaning the order or sequence of returns matters. The drawback is that previous drawdowns may not reflect potential risk or future drawdowns with much accuracy, particularly for short time periods. Again, the interpretation of the Sterling ratio is similar to that of the Sharpe or Sortino in that 0 is the break-even point and higher is better. In reflection of the previously mentioned Sharpe and Sortino ratios, the risk measurements are based on standard deviation and semi-deviation respectively. One of the criticisms of these risk measures is that they do not measure fat tails well and work best for normal distribution models. Financial returns are often not normally distributed. The omega ratio is designed to remove any distribution assumptions by simply measuring the probability of good versus bad returns. It is calculated by dividing the area to the right of a given threshold by the area to the left of this threshold. Thresholds are commonly 0% or the risk-free rate of return. Ratios above 1 indicate profitability potential, while ratios below 1 would be considered unprofitable. Thus far, 3 of the risk-reward metrics have all considered risk on an unconditional basis, meaning the previous returns or order of returns do not matter, the exception being maximum drawdown used in the Sterling ratio. In the dynamic risk tutorial, we describe a mathematical tool that measures risk conditionally, called Garch. The main point here is to know that Garch modeling allows one to account for volatility clustering. When risk increases or is elevated, it tends to stay elevated. We'll discuss 3 new metrics that incorporate Garch modeling. Combining 3 concepts from previous tutorials, namely Garch modeling, fat tail distributions, and the risk measurement expected shortfall, we can create the following. For brevity, we'll refer to this as the expected shortfall measurement, but it is really an expected shortfall measurement on a fat tail distribution with Garch modeling. Recall, expected shortfall can be computed at various percentile levels. For example, at the 1% level, the average loss beyond this percentile would be the expected shortfall. If we use this expected shortfall as the risk measure and combine it with the same excess return used in several other metrics, we get the STAR ratio. STAR stands for Stable Tail Adjusted Return Ratio. The advantage of this ratio is that, unlike the Sharpe ratio, skewness and fat-tail distributions can be measured effectively. The general interpretation is still similar to the Sharpe and Sortino, in that values above 0 are profitable and higher ratios are preferable. Related to this ratio is another called the Resheve ratio. Named for its developer, the Resheve ratio replaces the numerator of the star ratio with the potential gain of the right tail of a distribution. This right tail gain potential is the equivalent of what the expected shortfall measures on the downside, just reversed to measure the upside potential. A value of 1 for the Resheve ratio would indicate that extreme returns up or down are in balance, or have the same potential impact. Values above 1 would indicate higher potential gains than losses, and vice versa for values below 1. Finally, we'll introduce the dynamic omega ratio. As its name would suggest, this ratio computes the same general formula as the omega ratio, but with one key difference. Instead of using historical returns compared against the threshold, a distribution is modeled using Garch and fat-tail distribution modeling. The Garch element creates the dynamic aspect of the ratio. The shape of the model distribution can vary day to day as risk environments change. The risk-reward measurement of this changing distribution becomes the dynamic omega ratio and can provide a real-time assessment of risk and reward. Interpretation is similar to the omega ratio, with values of 1 being the break-even point of profitability and higher values being better. This completes the risk-reward ratios tutorial.